Here's something that'll blow your mind. In 1950, a Detroit factory worker with just a high school diploma could earn the equivalent of $100,000 in today's dollars when you account for purchasing power, benefits, and pensions. That same worker could buy a house, support a family of 4, own 2 cars, and retire comfortably at 55. Fast forward to today, and Detroit has a 35% poverty rate. Nearly half the adult population isn't functionally literate. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. When those factory jobs disappeared, something else filled the void. Gangs, drug empires that made $500 million in a single year, and a generation of kids who saw drug dealing as a more realistic path to success than education. So what the hell happened? Because the story of Detroit isn't just about one city, it's a preview of what's happening to working-class America everywhere. The golden era, when factory workers lived like kings. Let's go back to when Detroit factory workers were basically living the American dream on steroids. The early 1900s hit, and Henry Ford didn't just build cars in Detroit. He revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line at the Rouge River plant, the largest integrated factory on planet Earth. 100,000 workers, 12 miles of conveyor belts, and a car rolling off the line every 10 seconds at peak production. But here's what made Detroit different: the wages. In 1914, Henry Ford introduced the $5 workday. That's equivalent to about $150 per day in today's money, or $39,000 per year for assembly line work. But it wasn't just Ford. Chrysler and General Motors were competing for workers, driving wages up even further. By the 1950s, a Detroit auto worker was making the equivalent of $50 to $60 per hour in today's dollars, when you factor in benefits, pensions, and job security. These weren't just jobs. They were tickets to the middle class for people with no college degree. You could drop out of high school, walk into a factory, and within a few years, you'd own a home. The city's population exploded, 1.5 million by 1930, making Detroit the 4th largest city in America. European immigrants came for the jobs. Black Americans fled Jim Crow in the South during the Great Migration, looking for economic opportunity and dignity. And for a while, they found it. Detroit wasn't just a factory town. The public infrastructure was world-class. The Detroit Institute of Arts, the Detroit Public Library, state-of-the-art schools and hospitals. People called it the Paris of the Midwest. This was the American dream, tangible and real. A factory worker could live better than a doctor does in some cities today. The crack in the foundation, what they don't tell you. But even during the golden years, there were problems beneath the surface. And this is where people get uncomfortable, but we need to talk about it. First, Detroit's success was built entirely on one industry: automotive manufacturing. When you build an entire city's economy on one industry, you're building a house of cards. One strong economic wind and everything collapses. Second, and here's the controversial part that'll get people arguing in the comments, Detroit's golden era coincided with some of the most discriminatory housing practices in American history. Redlining wasn't just happening, it was systematic government policy. Black residents who'd migrated to Detroit for opportunity were literally blocked from buying homes in white neighborhoods through government-backed mortgage discrimination. The Federal Housing Administration actually had maps marking black neighborhoods in red, designating them as too risky for mortgage lending. Banks wouldn't give black families mortgages in white areas. This created segregated neighborhoods and built-in inequality. Black workers were doing the same factory jobs as white workers, but they couldn't build generational wealth through home ownership. This matters because when everything collapsed later, black communities had no financial cushion to fall back on. White families who'd bought homes in the suburbs in the 1950s had equity. Black families who'd been blocked from those same opportunities had nothing. The exodus, white flight, and the death spiral. After World War II, something started happening that would gut Detroit from the inside out. White flight. And yes, we're using that term because that's literally what historians call it. And pretending it didn't happen doesn't change reality. White residents started moving to the suburbs en masse. Was it just about race? No, it was also about newly affordable cars, making commuting possible, suburban development, and those new interstate highways. But let's not kid ourselves about what was driving this. Race played a massive role. The suburbs were marketed as safe, modern, and implicitly white. Meanwhile, black families were blocked from following through redlining and restrictive covenants. Every white family that left took their tax dollars with them. Property values in the city started dropping. Tax revenues declined. Public services deteriorated, which caused more people to leave. Classic death spiral. Then July 1967 happened. The Detroit Riots, or as some people call it, the Detroit Rebellion. And that difference in terminology tells you everything about how polarized people are about what happened. It started with a police raid on an unlicensed bar and exploded into 5 days of chaos. 43 people dead, 1,200 injured, 7,200 arrested, 1,400 buildings destroyed or burned. The National Guard was called in. Parts of Detroit looked like a war zone. The aftermath? White flight went into overdrive. Between 1950 and 1980, Detroit lost nearly half its population. But here's what's crucial. The people leaving weren't just individuals. They were taking their tax base, their businesses, their investment in the city's future. Detroit's budget collapsed. Schools got worse. Police and fire departments were understaffed. Infrastructure crumbled. And the people who stayed, predominantly black residents who couldn't afford to leave, were blamed for the city's decline. Think about that. The people who fled were never held accountable. The people who stayed got blamed for the problems white flight created. The knockout punch. Globalization destroys the dream. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, globalization entered the chat. The 1960s and 70s brought brutal foreign competition. Japanese and European car manufacturers started eating the Big Three's lunch. Why? Lower labor costs, more efficient production methods, and frankly, better quality control. The Big Three's response? Move production overseas or to cheaper states with lower wages and fewer unions. The result for Detroit? Factories closed. Unemployment skyrocketed. And here's where the story takes a turn that most documentaries skip over. Between 1950 and 1980, Detroit lost over 800,000 residents. The unemployment rate in black neighborhoods hit 25%, sometimes higher. The legitimate economy had completely abandoned these communities. No factory jobs. Retail businesses were leaving. Even grocery stores were closing. When legal work disappears, the underground economy emerges. So what happens when legal opportunity vanishes? When an entire generation of young people grows up watching their parents lose jobs, their neighborhoods deteriorate, their schools fall apart, illegal opportunity takes its place. Detroit had always had organized crime. The Purple Gang ran bootlegging during Prohibition in the 1920s. The Italian Mafia controlled rackets for decades. But what emerged in the 1970s and 80s was different. It wasn't traditional organized crime. It was economic desperation organized into business structures. Murder Row emerged in 1974, trafficking heroin. But they were nothing compared to what came in 1978. A gang called Young Boys Incorporated, YBI, that would change everything about how drug organizations operated in America. They figured out something revolutionary: recruit children, kids as young as 11, 12, 13 years old. Why? Because under Michigan law at the time, juveniles couldn't be prosecuted like adults. Even if they got arrested a dozen times, they'd be back on the streets within hours. It was a legal loophole, and they exploited it ruthlessly. And the money was staggering. In 1982 alone, YBI netted nearly $500 million. That's not a typo. $480 million from a drug gang. That would put them on the Fortune 500 list if they were a legal company. Think about what that means for a Detroit teenager in 1980. The factories are closed. Your dad hasn't worked in 2 years. Your mom is working 2 jobs and still can't pay the bills. Your school is literally falling apart. No heat in winter, broken windows, teachers who've given up. You're wearing the same clothes you wore last year. And then someone offers you $300 per day to stand on a corner. That's over $1,000 in today's money, more than your parents ever made in the factories. And you look around and the only people in your neighborhood with money, with cars, with nice clothes, with anything, they're all working for the gangs. If you're that kid, what choice are you making? Be honest with yourself. This wasn't just YBI. After federal authorities took them down in the mid-80s, others emerged. Pony Down, best friends who specialized in contract killings. The Latin Kings in Southwest Detroit. Each time one organization got dismantled, another took its place, because the underlying problem never got fixed. By the 1980s, Detroit had some of the highest murder rates in America. In 2006, Detroit's violent crime rate was 2,419 incidents per 100,000 people. The national average? 479. Let that sink in. Detroit was 5 times more violent than the rest of America. The education trap, why just go to school, became meaningless. Now here's where people love to jump in with, well, why didn't people just get educated? Why didn't they go to college and get out? Let me give you the numbers that answer that question. As of today, 47% of Detroit adults are not functionally literate. Almost half the adult population struggles to read. How did that happen? When white flight happened and the tax base collapsed, Detroit schools lost funding drastically. By the 1980s and 90s, Detroit public schools were characterized by massive teacher vacancies, broken heating and cooling systems, lack of textbooks, and violence. These weren't schools. They were holding facilities where kids were warehoused until they aged out. Today, Detroit's child poverty rate is 43%. That means nearly half of Detroit children are growing up in poverty. 10% of Detroit students are homeless. 65% qualify for free or reduced lunch. When you're worried about where you're sleeping tonight or whether you'll eat today, algebra becomes pretty irrelevant. When your school doesn't have heat in winter and your teacher is the 5th substitute this month because the district can't keep teachers, learning becomes nearly impossible. Only 12% of Black youth from Detroit and 4% of Latino youth hold bachelor's degrees or higher. The national average for those groups is 21% and 18% respectively. But here's the part that makes this even more tragic. Michigan now offers the Michigan Achievement Scholarship, Michigan Reconnect for adults, and the Detroit Promise for Detroit students. These programs make college affordable or even free, but 60% of parents still think college is too expensive for them. Why? Because the entire system feels inaccessible. When you're in survival mode, when nobody in your family has gone to college, when your school counselor doesn't tell you about scholarships, when you don't have transportation to even visit a college campus, opportunity becomes theoretical. And here's the cycle. Parents who were failed by the education system don't trust it for their kids. Students who've watched their older siblings graduate and still struggle to find work don't see the point. The entire community has developed what researchers call learned helplessness. The belief that effort doesn't matter because the system is rigged against you anyway. And the uncomfortable truth, they're not entirely wrong. The system was rigged against them for decades. The 2008 collapse, the final blow. Fast forward to 2008, Detroit is already struggling, unemployment is high, the population is down to about 900,000 from its 1950 peak of 1.8 million. And then the financial crisis hits like a sledgehammer. The automotive industry gets decimated. The 2003 to 2008 oil crisis had already made the big three's gas-guzzling vehicles less attractive. Now the 2008 financial crisis meant nobody was buying cars at all. Consumer spending collapsed. Credit markets tightened. By late 2008, Chrysler and GM were facing bankruptcy. The U.S. government had to bail them out. But even with the bailout, both companies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2009. Thousands upon thousands of jobs lost, not just at the big three, but across the entire supply chain. Parts suppliers, dealerships, associated businesses, all gone. Detroit's unemployment rate surged. Between 2000 and 2013, Detroit lost 237,000 more residents, a 25% population decline in just over a decade. The city needed a tax base of 750,000 people minimum to maintain basic services. They had 700,000 and dropping. July 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, $18 to $20 billion in debt, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. Pensions got slashed. People who'd worked for the city for decades, who'd stayed through the worst times, saw their retirement security disappear. Schools closed. Police and fire departments were cut to the bone. Streetlights stopped working in entire neighborhoods. Ambulance response times became a dark joke. Parts of Detroit looked post-apocalyptic. And throughout all of this, the people who stayed, predominantly Black residents, continued to be blamed for Detroit's failure. Not the auto executives who moved production overseas, not the white families who fled to the suburbs and took the tax base, not the corrupt politicians. The blame fell on the people who had the least power and the fewest options. The uncomfortable conclusion. So what happened to Detroit workers? They went from earning the equivalent of $100,000 per year with full benefits to living in a city with 35% poverty, where gang membership seemed more economically rational than education. This didn't happen by accident. This was the result of specific policy choices, economic decisions, and systematic abandonment. White flight was enabled by government policy. Globalization was encouraged by corporate decisions. Educational collapse happened because nobody in power cared enough to prevent it. The rise of gangs was inevitable when legal work disappeared. And here's what should terrify everyone. Detroit isn't unique. This is happening in cities across America. Anywhere the working class relied on a single industry, anywhere manufacturing has fled, anywhere economic opportunity has vanished, you're seeing the same pattern. From $100,000 factory jobs to food stamps isn't a Detroit problem. It's an American problem. And until we're willing to invest the resources necessary to create real economic opportunity for working class people, we're going to keep creating more Detroits. But this story isn't over, because Detroit is experiencing what some call a comeback. Downtown is booming, crime is down, new businesses are opening. Forbes hosted their 30 Under 30 summit there. So is Detroit back? And if so, who's actually winning? That's part 2, because the answer is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And if you want to understand why people don't trust the system, why the comeback feels hollow to many longtime residents, you need to know what happened during Detroit's darkest years, the gang era, when children built a $500 million drug empire because the legal economy had abandoned them. That's part 3, and that story is darker than you think.